Hi, Jacob.
Hi, Will.
How you doing today?
I'm doing all right. We're getting blanketed under what's approaching a foot of snow in Montreal after just a week of winter, so that's less good than it could be, but otherwise doing pretty well.
Yeah, the snow and the Montreal, they kind of go together.
They do go together.
Like, peaches and cream or ham and rye. It's pretty snowy here in Iowa. I know everybody likes the weather report at the beginning of the segment. So if you're wondering about the weather in Montreal and in Iowa City, the forecast is snow. We should introduce ourselves. I'm Will Wilkinson of the Cato Institute, and Jacob, why don't you introduce yourself and tell people a little bit about who you are and what you do?
I am Jacob Levy. I am Tomlinson Professor of Political Theory at McGill, as well as an intermittent blogger at jacobtlevy.blogspot.com. I work on contemporary normative political theory having to do with multiculturalism and federalism and constitutional theory, as well as working on the history of political thought, primarily 18th century, the Enlightenment, and the origins of constitutionalist and federalist theory.
Excellent. That was a very concise and informative resume.
I'm happy to recite my resume for the whole hour if you would like, but I figured that wouldn't be of the greatest interest.
I would be interested, but I think what everybody wants to know about, and the reason that there's lots of reasons to have you on, Jacob. One of the main reason, which is that you are a fascinating political theorist, and I want to talk about some of your ideas, and we're friends from a good ways back, and I just like to talk to you. But I'm hoping to get a little bit of insight from you on the craziness that is Canadian politics. You are not yourself Canadian, but you live in Canada, and you're a political scientist, and I suppose that you can have that sort of outsider insight, like de Tocqueville in America or something like that. So because I have no idea what's going on, and it seems like craziness, like the government's been shut down or something. And when I think of Canadian politics, I think of just a kind of milquetoast politeness. I'm half Canadian, and an aspiring Canadian. And I have Canadian relatives.
An ancestral Canadian, as I recall.
I'm an ancestral Canadian. I feel deeply connected to the lakes and prairies of Saskatchewan. But I don't really understand Canadian politics, and so if I'm ever going to be a credible Canadian, I'm going to have to figure out what's going on. So all I really know about Canadian politics is that there are weird things called like ridings, which I've always enjoyed. And that it's a parliamentary system, and that there's a lot of parties that have to get together in coalitions. But I don't really understand what's going on right now, and why what's happened has happened. So I was hoping you could fill us in on some of that to begin with. So go for it.
It has been it's been about the strangest 2 to 3 weeks I've ever seen in politics, and that includes the 2000 election in Florida and the United States. Canada is a federal system and a parliamentary system. It has provinces with provincial governments, and at the federal level, it has a parliament at each level that has a separately elected government. Unlike in the U.S., the parties don't map very tightly onto each other at the federal level and at the provincial level. There was a Quebec election over the last 2 weeks, as well as being a constitutional crisis at the federal level over the last 2 weeks. And the parties competing in Quebec were sometimes aligned with, but never the same as, the parties that are the players at the federal level. So I'm going to have to mention a bunch of different names, but I will do my best to keep reminding what each of the party names means.
Okay. I'm going to take notes.
Okay. At the federal level, for the last 2 years, for the last 2 years, there has been a conservative minority government led by Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Conservative is the party. Minority government in a parliamentary system means that the Prime Minister commands a plurality of votes in the relevant House, the House of Commons, but not a majority of votes, because the House of Commons is split among more than two parties. In the case of Canada, it's split among primarily three parties at the federal level. Now, political scientists.
And what are those main three parties? Just to, like...
the main three. I'm sorry, four parties. The main four parties at the federal level are the Conservatives that are the government, the Liberals that are the traditional party of government in Canada. They've ruled Canada for more of the last 100 years than any other party. It's the party of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and they are the official opposition. The New Democratic Party, which is a socialist party, an avowedly socialist party. This isn't like the United States, where socialist is just a bad word that you use to describe someone who you think is a little bit left of center. They are socialists and proud to be socialists. And the Bloc Québécois. And the Bloc Québécois is a party that is only elected from Quebec, and it is a sovereigntist, that is a secessionist party. Its platform consists of advocating for Quebec secession. And this matters for a whole lot of what's going to happen. The Bloc Québécois is not interested in governing Canada. It is interested in representing Quebec's interests until the day that it looks forward to when Quebec becomes an independent country.
Excellent.
The Bloc Québécois often, and including in the most recent election, commands a majority of the seats that are elected from Quebec. It is a very popular thing in Quebec to vote for the Bloc to represent Quebec's interests at the federal level. Something that Quebec voters like to do is to elect the Bloc to federal parliament, its nearly aligned secessionist party to Quebec government. That party will then call a referendum on secession, which the voters will reject. But they think that they negotiate more forcefully with the federal government for Quebec's interests when they vote for these secessionist parties. And it frustrates the leaders of the secessionist parties because they actually want to rule an independent country. The voters don't quite want that, or at least there's enough voters who would rather just negotiate really, really aggressively with Canada.
Let me see if I can reiterate the logic of that, because that's kind of convoluted. So the people in Quebec tend to vote for the Bloc Québécois to represent them in the national parliament.
That's right.
They tend to vote for the related secessionist party to lead Quebec's provincial government.
At least sometimes. Say every other election, every third election.
Every other election, So on the face of it, it would seem that the Quebec electorate is sort of pro-secession because they're so strongly supporting secessionist parties. But every time secession comes up as a referendum, they reject it. Right. And the idea there then is that they're supporting the secessionist parties because they think that party, especially at the national level, if it represents them, has more bargaining leverage than they would otherwise have. Something like that?
The phrase in Canadian politics that Anglophone Canadians use to describe this process is negotiating with a knife to the throat of Canada. And Quebec voters like to put that knife in the hands of the Bloc Québécois. They like to scare the federal government with the prospect of secession in order to get more resources, more autonomy, more provincial authority to be vested in Quebec.
Okay, well that's a vivid image. Okay, so with some of the background of who the major party players are, now let's back up and try to explain some of what's gone on then just recently.
Okay, for the last 2 years, Conservative Stephen Harper has had a minority government. He called an election in the fall to try to boost that to being a majority government. A minority government is always vulnerable. It can always be dissolved whenever all of the opposition parties get together and decide to dissolve it. And it can't do anything without the consent of at least one opposition party. Harper has been a pretty popular prime minister. He is widely disliked among a number of Canadian left-leaning political elites, but he has a substantial degree of popularity on the ground, especially in the West.
I get the sense that Naomi Klein doesn't like him.
Naomi Klein does not like him. That's right. He looks to Naomi Klein like an unreconstructed Friedmanite libertarian, which roughly means that he is, by American standards, only 15 points left of center rather than 30 points left of center.
Yeah.
To be a free marketeer in Canada is not anything that is going to impress any American. But by Canadian standards, Harper is a little bit of a free marketeer. He's a little bit of a low-tax guy.
Where's Harper from? What's his home province?
I'm pretty sure he's from Alberta.
Okay.
Which is considered to be the Texas of Canada. It is Western. It is culturally conservative. It is a cowboy kind of place, and it is driven by a very oil-dependent economy.
Mm-hmm. Outstanding. Okay, so
okay.
Harper
calls a new election,
mm-hmm.
hoping to be elected to a majority government, hoping to increase his representation in the House of Commons. There's speculation that he especially wanted to do this before Obama was elected president of the United States, because he thought that that election would revitalize and encourage Canadians to feel like proud left-leaning types, and that if he waited too much longer, Canadians might get swept up in a post-Obama kind of wave of enthusiasm for progressive government and throw him out.
Hmm.
He calls an election, and then the financial crisis hits. This is not something that he could have foreseen, but it is strongly his own fault. He chose the timing of this election, and then it blew up in his face.
Can you hold on a second? And so this is something that I think it still confuses me. I don't understand how it works in parliamentary systems.
In a parliamentary system.
Like how,
in a parliamentary system. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just the issue of calling elections, like what's the convention, and like kind of what degree of freedom does the Prime Minister have to determine the timing of an election?
Traditionally, a Prime Minister in a parliamentary system has a lot of freedom. They need the consent in a Westminster system, that is, say, a British parliamentary system. They need the consent of the Queen or the Queen's representative, and in Canada, the Queen's representative is the Governor-General. But that consent is essentially always given, because the monarch is supposed to be a non-political figure. And whenever the Prime Minister goes to the monarch or the Governor-General and says, I need a new election, it is time for a new election, then one will be held. However, they cannot wait indefinitely. The norm, I believe, in both Britain and Canada has been something like 5 years, and there's a law that I just don't know the details of in both places that says there must be an election no later than 5 years or so from the last election. And an election is ordinarily called if the Prime Minister loses the confidence of the House of Commons.
Okay.
Where losing the confidence is not a metaphor, it is not expression of how much they like him, it is a vote. If a vote of no confidence is held, and the House of Commons votes no confidence in the Prime Minister, then the Governor-General or the Monarch of England will call a new election. Stephen Harper had, in a prior term, put through legislation that would have restricted the Prime Minister's authority to call snap elections. He claimed this year that it didn't apply to minority governments. Now, it wasn't binding. There's nothing that anyone judicially could do about it. But it was the case that he had gone out of his way to say that it was a problem in the Canadian Constitution that Prime Ministers could call an election just whenever they thought that they could get an advantage from it.
Yeah.
And that he wanted Canada to move to a more regularized term of office. But he said, I'm in a minority government. I cannot govern effectively in a minority government. I need a new election now.
Yeah.
The Governor-General gave it to him. He went into an election campaign. Then the financial crisis, and incumbent parties don't do well under conditions of great meltdown, even if very little of it is the incumbent party's fault.
Right.
So Harper gets reelected to another minority government. It's stronger than the one he'd had before. He gains seats, but he doesn't gain a majority. The Liberal Party, the main opposition party, really embarrassingly loses a lot of seats.
Now, who's the head of the... Oh, you were just about to tell me. Who's the head of the Liberal Party?
I'm just about to tell you.
Okay.
As of the election, the leader of the Liberal Party was Stéphane Dion, a Montreal-based political scientist who's been in politics for 25 years, and for much of that time has been one of the leading figures within Quebec arguing against secession, arguing for federalism, that is, say, for Quebec to be part of the Canadian Federation. And so he's very widely disliked among a lot of Quebec voters, even who aren't rabid secessionists, because they think that he has been a sellout of Quebec interests. He was the leader.
But he succeeds in getting elected to Parliament because of his particular district.
Because of his particular riding, because of his particular district, yes.
Okay.
He does very badly. He leads the Liberals to a very bad performance in the election, and he announces that he will resign in May. It will take that long for the Liberal Party to meet its constitutional rules for the selection of a new leader, which involves a national convention. So, as of a week after the election or so, you have a strengthened minority government led by the conservative Stephen Harper and a lame duck leader of the opposition, Stéphane Dion. Then Stephen Harper presents an interim budget. And in the interim budget, he proposes to abolish taxpayer funding of political parties.
Mm-hmm.
The Conservative Party, Harper's party, gets only about a third of its revenue from the government.
Mm-hmm.
Every other party in Canada is overwhelmingly dependent on taxpayer subsidies for its financing. So
now,
this would be
was this just intended as a screw you guys, gonna move?
Yes, it was.
Yes,
it was
intended to be
I'm in charge now, and here let me kneecap my opposition. Let me just show how strong I am.
Mm-hmm.
Conspicuously and importantly, this was almost the only new economic or fiscal legislation that he was introducing during a time of financial crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And the opposition parties were able to point out very strongly, gee, it turns out the first thing that Stephen Harper thinks needs to be done at a time when the economy is melting down is to cut off the funding to all opposition parties.
Mm-hmm.
So I started to say a little while ago.
So what did they do?
Political science. We'll get there.
Okay.
I started to say a little while ago, political scientists think that minority governments are strange.
Mm-hmm.
The incentives all seem to be that if you have multiple parties in a parliament, that enough of them will join together in a coalition to have a majority of votes in the House of Commons. And then you split up the seats in the cabinet, you split up the goodies according to the proportions of those seats. That is, for example, how it always works in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
One of the two big parties, either the big right-leaning party or the big left-leaning party, puts together a coalition with with one or more little parties.
Mm-hmm.
That's how it ordinarily works in Italy and Poland and Israel and so on. It doesn't work that way in Canada. Canada has a political culture that is not favorable toward coalitions. The Liberals and the NDP, which are the most natural coalition partners, have so much history of bad blood between them that they just don't do it. And everyone thinks that you can't enter into a coalition with the Bloc Québécois, because the Bloc Québécois isn't interested in governing Canada, it's interested in having Quebec secede from Canada. So it is an inappropriate coalition partner.
So if are the numbers there? So putting aside the Bloc Québécois, if the Libs and the NDP got together, would they have enough to be larger than the Conservatives?
In the previous Parliament, before the last election, that would have been the case.
Mm-hmm.
In the new Parliament, it is not the case.
Mm.
The Conservatives outnumbered even the Libs and the NDP put together.
Okay.
However, it's a minority government. They don't outnumber all three other parties put together.
Mm-hmm.
Harper threatens to cut off the funding to all of the other political parties. And mortal threat concentrates the mind.
Mm-hmm.
The Liberals and the NDP, who have spent years and decades not thinking about coalitions, and even not thinking about coalition during the last Parliament when they jointly outnumbered the Conservatives, they suddenly thought about a coalition. And they got together with each other, and they got together with the Bloc Québécois. And they announced that they were prepared jointly to vote no confidence in the government, and to ask the Governor-General for permission to form a new government. There would be a Liberal NDP coalition with the Bloc not taking part in government but supporting it.
Mm-hmm.
And they had the votes. That was a majority of the House of Commons.
Mm-hmm.
This is not something that happened in Canada. And it's a coalition government that would have had as the new Prime Minister Stéphane Dion, who had just lost the election so badly that he's been forced to resign as Liberal leader. He was a lame duck leader of his own party,
Mm-hmm.
who all of a sudden looked to be about a week away from becoming Prime Minister.
Okay.
Harper withdrew the threat to withdraw funding, but at that point, the coalition talks had gotten underway, and the coalition had apparently been put together, and the intention to vote no confidence in the government was intact. Once you've threatened the livelihood of your opponents, they don't forget it quickly just because you withdraw the threat.
Right.
It appeared at one point that Harper was less than 48 hours from falling as Prime Minister. The interim budget that he was going to introduce was a mandatory confidence measure. If he lost the vote on that budget, then he would lose the Prime Ministership. Then a question would be presented to the Governor General, who is this appointed delegate of the Queen of England.
Mm-hmm.
And the question to the Governor General would be, does she accept the request by the Liberals and the NDP with support from the Bloc to put together a new government with Dion at its head, or do they go to a new election? In Canada, governments don't change without elections.
Mm-hmm.
However, you could make a case that this was just the outcome of the last election. People hadn't realized it was the outcome of the last election. They had gone around for a few weeks saying, Harper won the election, Dion lost. But really, all that happened is people elected a bunch of people to Parliament. Parliament was about to meet for the first time, and in its first meeting, Parliament would vote no confidence in the Prime Minister and say that Stéphane Dion was the person who potentially had the confidence of the majority of the House of Commons. There was an extraordinary upsurge in constitutional discussion among Canadians. Do our parliamentary rules mean that just whoever commands a majority of the House of Commons gets to be Prime Minister? Or does our sensibility about democratic government mean you can't have a Prime Minister who seems to have just lost an election?
Yeah. So let me go back to this question. I mean, so the crux of the issue is the question of what the outcome of the election was, right? So the issue is the indeterminacy of the outcome of the election.
That's right.
Right. So the assumption was that because, so I mean, Harper and the Conservatives, the outcome of this last election, it put them in a stronger position than they were in the previous position in which they formed an indisputably legitimate government.
That's right.
So they've done even better now.
Yes.
And but then all of a sudden there's this idea that no, the outcome of the election, now that because there was always the possibility that the other parties could form a coalition, but they just didn't. Right? And so in this case, they have formed a coalition. Parliament hasn't yet met, so the government hasn't yet. Is the idea that the government isn't formed until Parliament meets for the first time?
Legally, the government is formed when the Governor General asks one leader to form a government.
Mm-hmm.
But then it doesn't cement. It doesn't really take until that government is shown to have the confidence of the House of Commons.
So had the Governor General already asked Harper to form a government?
Yes.
Okay, so that's part of the issue, too.
It's an interesting counterfactual. What would have happened if the coalition had been put together the day after the election? And the Governor General had been put in a position right away where she seemed to have to ask Dion rather than Harper.
What's the name of the Governor General again?
Michelle Jean. She is a French and Afro-Caribbean ancestry woman. I think that's right, Michelle Jean. It happened that she was in France as much of this was happening. She wasn't even on site in Canada.
And so part of the weird thing about this is usually the Governor General plays this purely formal ceremonial
passive,
role.
symbolic role. It should be ceremonial. It should be a ratification of the transparent, obvious thing that has happened in the election.
Because everybody thinks it's just kind of a joke. Nobody really thinks that the Queen is in charge of Canada.
That's exactly analogous.
Right. So
right.
The
or for that matter, nobody really thinks that the Queen is in charge of the British Parliament.
Right.
The Queen chooses as Prime Minister whoever is the leader of the party that wins the most votes in a British parliamentary election. The Queen's constitutional role is limited to that. She just accepts and ratifies the democratic outcomes. But here the democratic outcomes have yielded procedural results that are in some sense indeterminate. It's not clear.
That's amazing.
So Harper goes into overdrive.
Okay.
He goes into a public relations offensive. First, against the idea that Canada would change governments without an election. And second, against the idea that a government of Canada would rest on the support of the Bloc Québécois.
Mm-hmm.
Third, and tertiarily, but he abandons this quickly when there doesn't seem to be uptake for it, that a government of Canada in a financial crisis would be composed in part of socialists.
Mm-hmm.
It turned out that didn't scare Canadians very much. But there was genuine reaction, really serious reaction in Anglophone Canada, and particularly in the West, against the idea that a government of Canada would be reliant on the support of the Bloc Québécois.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the Bloc has a lot of seats. It has so many seats that it's been kind of anomalous for a long time that the government of Canada was just always constructed, as it were, without reference to all of these seats in Parliament. But now, for the first time, a government was going to be dependent on the Bloc. He tries to persuade Canadians that all of this means what the Coalition and Dion are proposing to do is constitutionally illegitimate. He's prepared to lose a confidence vote,
mm-hmm.
but he expects to get an election if he loses a confidence vote.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, however, clear that the Governor-General will give him an election, because it could credibly be argued that he just wasn't really Prime Minister yet
mm-hmm.
until Parliament met for the first time. So, he tries and tries to stir up public opposition. He makes some progress, but public opposition doesn't have any procedural voice. It's still
mm-hmm.
the case that he only has a minority of votes in the House of Commons.
Yeah.
So he needs a procedure. He needs not just an opinion poll. He needs something that he can pull a trigger on in Ottawa.
Mm-hmm.
The thing he can pull a trigger on in Ottawa is to go to the Governor-General the morning after she had come back from a transatlantic flight from France so that she could be here during the constitutional crisis, and ask her to prorogue Parliament. Prorogue being a procedural verb that has no meaning or relevance in the American constitutional system, but it amounts to a suspension, a timeout. Parliament will go home for 6 weeks, and the mandatory, regularly scheduled vote of confidence won't happen. It won't happen until late January when he presents a real budget, not just an interim budget. This gives him 6 weeks to maneuver, to try to keel off some Liberal members of Parliament who aren't comfortable resting on the Bloc Québécois, or to rally public
mm-hmm.
opinion, or otherwise to do something. Because otherwise, he was going to lose the prime ministership as soon as Parliament met.
Yeah.
The only thing he had to present to Parliament was a mandatory confidence vote that he was going to lose. The Governor-General was not necessarily obligated to honor the request to prorogue. This
mm-hmm.
is such a constitutionally strange state of affairs that it's not really clear even what the passive role of the Governor-General should be.
Mm-hmm.
The Constitutional Convention, the constitutional norm, is the Governor-General shouldn't be too active a participant in political questions. But neither should a Prime Minister who doesn't have the confidence of Parliament be able to just send Parliament home forever and never face the vote of no confidence that should make his government fall.
Right.
In the event, she grants the request.
Mm-hmm.
So we are now in a 6-week-long timeout. And during that timeout, Stéphane Dion decided to speed up his departure from the leadership of the Liberal Party. Now, he decided this in part because he badly mishandled the endgame before the prorogue.
Yeah.
Harper and Dion both addressed the country on television the night before the proroguing request. Now, a lot of Canadians complain that Stephen Harper seems presidential. He thinks that he is like an American president.
Mm-hmm.
And in a parliamentary system, that implies a certain amount of arrogance and a certain amount of deference to the office that isn't actually what prime ministers are ordinarily entitled to. Nonetheless, presidential really works on television.
Mm-hmm.
He sat there at a great big wooden desk with flags behind him in his suit and gave a speech to the public that would have been recognizable to an American audience, well, rather better than any presidential address that Americans have had over the last 8 years, but in general, it's the kind of thing.
Harper's a smooth guy. I mean, that's
Harper's a smooth guy.
Yeah, I mean,
and he gave a good talk.
Yeah, I mean, so if Americans are thinking that the leader of the Conservative Party in Canada is the kind of like Republican, sort of like down homey, that's not what the Conservative leader is like. They tend to be a very slick, articulate, sort of businessman-like.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely, that's right.
Okay.
Dion's response, his nationally televised response, shows up 40 minutes late to all of the television networks. He refuses to do it live. He insists on doing it taped. He can't get the tapes to the networks in time. And when it gets there, it looks, well, not quite as good as the video quality on Blogging Heads looks. It's
what happened?
Amateurish in the extreme. I don't know.
I mean, I can understand. Dion's English isn't spectacular.
Dion's English is poor.
So I can understand why he'd want to record it, because I've seen clips where he gets kind of stumbles in interviews because he wasn't clear what was being said, in just sort of casual vernacular English. So it makes sense that he'd want to record it, but it's not like the Liberals don't have good television studios.
Professional cameramen, I know. Yeah. And part of the point of recording it is surely that you can do it over again if you're stumbling over words constantly, which he was. Will, you're not going to be able to see this, but for the viewers, I will reposition myself to something like the position Dion had in the frame. It always looked like he was trying to get his head high enough over the bar so that even his whole head would appear in the box, rather than sitting in a way that meant that he was visible or his hands would be visible. Moreover, right about here, a book that was visible right behind his head said in great big block letters on the spine, "Hot Air." It was presumably a book about hot air ballooning or something like that, but you could just imagine that it was a speech balloon coming out of the politician's head to the book that had text visible on national television that's "Hot Air" right beside his head.
Wow.
And it was out of focus, and it was shaky. It was an embarrassment. It was one of the most amazingly silly, unprofessional, amateurish things I've ever seen in serious politics. We don't know that this had any effect on the Governor-General's decision to grant the request to prorogue.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly Dion didn't make any overwhelming case for the view that he was ready to be Prime Minister that night.
Yeah.
So, after the prorogue request is granted, and Parliament gets its time out, Dion comes under overwhelming pressure to quit. And he does.
So
he is replaced after...
Yeah. Who's coming next?
Go ahead.
I just wanted to know who's next in line for the Liberals.
There was going to be a struggle. There was going to be a contest that was a fast-forward of the contest that was otherwise going to happen in May between the two people Dion beat for the position a couple of years ago. One of them dropped out, and in the end, the new Liberal leader is someone who will be known to a certain number of Blogging Heads viewers, Michael Ignatieff. Ignatieff is a sometime political philosopher. He was head of the Human Rights Program at Harvard. He was an important figure for a while in the mid to late 90s and the early 2000s in the liberal human rights hawkish side of the American commentariat. Mm-hmm. He wrote a number of pieces for the New York Times Magazine about why human rights advocates ought to support humanitarian intervention, and more or less saying that human rights advocates had to support the invasion of Iraq. Ignatieff returned to Canada a few years ago to enter liberal politics, hoping to become liberal leader a couple years ago. He struck out then, he lost to Dion, but now he is liberal leader.
Well, what would be like
widely thought?
What would be like an American parallel of that? Would that be like Michael Walzer becoming like the Democratic presidential nominee or something like that? I mean,
it's even a little stranger than that.
Yeah.
On one hand, Ignatieff is a certain kind of Canadian aristocracy. His family on both sides has for 100 years been occupying positions of power and authority and prestige throughout Canada. On the other hand, Michael Ignatieff effectively left Canada some 25 years ago. He went off to study at Oxford. He did lectures to the BBC. He became a roving kind of journalist scholar doing work in Eastern and Central Europe. He became a professor at Harvard. He has not been, for most of 2 decades, he was not a resident of or even a very regular visitor to Canada. He leaves Harvard, he comes back to Canada, he's elected to Parliament, and almost immediately he's a contender for the Liberal leadership, and only a couple of years after that he successfully gains the Liberal leadership. Now, in intellectual terms, in terms of professional capacities, Michael Walzer is a pretty good example. Ignatieff is close to Walzer in certain ways. On the other hand, we did just elect a sometime lecturer in constitutional law at the University of Chicago Law School to the American presidency. It's not inconceivable for someone who is professorial to be elected. Canadians, I think, romanticize it in a way that Americans don't. Right. Obama never made a big deal out of the fact that he was a professor. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the great leader of Canada in the 20th century, Pierre Elliott Trudeau was a PhD, was a same-time professor, and left a romance of the philosopher king in the Canadian political psyche. And Ignatieff pretty deliberately has cultivated the memory of Trudeau and sought to be the next celebrity philosopher king in Canadian politics and to follow in Trudeau's footsteps.
Yeah, as an important aside, my grandmother and grandfather once had a standard poodle named Pierre Trudeau.
Was this meant as a tribute, or was this meant as kind of an insult?
I've never been able to get my grandmother to be clear about that. She's very cagey. Yeah, I was over Thanksgiving. I asked her, and she kind of made it sound like it was a mild dig, but at the same time, it seems like she had, she had a thing for Trudeau. So he was like a very sexy, jet-setting, glamorous type at the time.
He really was. He was a style plate. There's something that's a little bit like Kennedy, except Kennedy was only president for 3 years, and Trudeau was prime minister for most of 20.
Yeah, I'll have to clarify that the next time I talk to my grandmother about the naming of the dog. But anyway, he was an important enough president that people would name their poodles after him, even after they moved to America.
Right. So Ignatieff succeeds the Liberal leadership, and now what happens isn't quite clear, because Ignatieff is generally thought to be less sympathetic to a coalition with the Socialist New Democratic Party, and is sure to be less sympathetic to a coalition resting on the support of Bloc Québécois than Dion was, or than Ignatieff's rival for the leadership was. What he has said publicly is that he will lead a coalition government if necessary, but he is not necessarily in support of a coalition. He has issued a set of demands on Harper for what Harper's budget that he presents in January must include. There's a sense that Harper has room to maneuver to present a budget that will be sufficiently acceptable to Ignatieff, that Ignatieff will not bring the government down, and he will not take power as prime minister leading a coalition government. He would probably rather wait as leader of the opposition for a year or so, then bring the government down, then have an election and be elected what he would hope to be a majority prime minister, not having to rule alongside the New Democratic Party and the Bloc Québécois.
Yeah, because it wouldn't actually, it wouldn't be a big prize for him. I mean, if he brings the government down and then Ignatieff is able to, become prime. I mean, it's not ideal conditions at all, right?
It's not ideal conditions.
That might
His hands would be very tied.
That might be the conservatives' dream, right? That might be the sort of thing that generates a real majority for them in the next election. If they, if he ends up governing with this really
if the Liberals are too tied to the Bloc Québécois, it really could be.
Mm-hmm.
If the Conservatives can go into the next election really demagoguing the fact that the Liberals depended on the Bloc, then they might do very well out of that. I think Ignatieff doesn't want that. He doesn't want it substantively. The Liberal Party, deep in its bones, is antagonistic to the Bloc Québécois. Pierre-Elliott Trudeau was the great champion of Canadian unity and of incorporating Quebec into a unified Canadian federation. He doesn't want it substantively, and he doesn't want it politically. Depending on the Bloc's support, would be a certain kind of millstone around his neck. He'd rather have a majority government in another year. So Harper may have saved his hide. Or Stéphane Dion's amateurish performance on TV using his little webcam may have saved Stephen Harper's hide, or something. But from being almost certain to lose his prime ministership within about 48 hours at one point, Stephen Harper now looks tolerably likely to make it through a year, and to make it at least long enough that when his government falls, there will be a new election rather than a replacement without an election by this coalition government. However, Ignatieff has said that if the budget is unacceptable, and by unacceptable he means things like there's not what he takes to be a sufficient stimulus package in response to the economic meltdown, that he is prepared to bring the government down in January and seek to take power at the head of a coalition.
So they're trying to use what leverage they have to extract, what they want politically out of the budget.
That's right.
And is there a sense that it's likely that Harper will go along with that to just hold on?
It's not clear to me, and I'm not sure that it's clear to much of anyone. Harper's office isn't very leaky. So I haven't seen reports in the news that say Harper is obviously going to do what he has to do to make the budget palatable. Harper is a canny political operator, but he's also pretty arrogant. That's part of what's happened over the last month, is he overplayed his hand. He acted like he had a majority in the House of Commons when he didn't.
Yeah.
So
what's
decide.
people's attitude towards so the whole thing is precipitated by the move to cut taxpayer funding for the political parties. Is the sense now that was just a huge tactical mistake that was driven by his arrogance?
Yes.
So is he in any danger?
There is some chance that this will cost Harper his own support within the Conservative Party as leader.
Yeah.
It was a tremendous tactical mistake on Harper's part. Everyone agrees with this.
So there are
nonetheless, he still is who he is, and he could decide to put forward a budget that he thinks will force Ignatieff into an uncomfortable choice. Harper could gamble again and lose.
Yeah.
He's like that. He could decide, I'm so sure that Ignatieff doesn't want to get into bed with the NDP and the Bloc Québécois that I'll force Ignatieff into voting for a budget that he doesn't like. Well, as of right now, Ignatieff could still put together the votes for no confidence vote at the drop of a hat. And there are going to be both tactical and personality questions in play as to what Harper does.
So if he decided to stare down the coalition or Ignatieff and say, this I'm not going to give you what you want in the budget, and force that choice, and he wins, then he kind of looks like a stud, right? Like he looks like
that's right, and he looks like a stud to himself.
Yeah, so he looks like he's in charge, and everybody knows it. If he loses that stare down, then he probably is going to lose his position as the head of the Conservatives. Is that likely? Like if he makes that gamble and loses,
that's certainly right. If he loses a vote of confidence and ceases to be prime minister, he will immediately also be deposed as leader of the Conservative Party.
Now is there anybody?
I don't know who will replace him.
Yeah. But. Are there up and comers in the Conservative Party who would be plausible replacements? or is he just so dominant?
There probably are, but I don't know who they are. For most of the last few years, I've lived here for going on 3 years now. What I've followed in local politics has been Quebec, not Canada. It's only really with the constitutional crisis in the last couple of weeks that I've put a fair amount of this together at the federal level, and who the plausible successors to Harper are in the Conservative Party, I just don't know. Nonetheless, there will be someone, because if Harper has won an election and blown it, and blown it for reasons that everyone always knew were problems with Harper, that he's arrogant, that he's obnoxious, that he overplays his hand, that he's kind of a bully. The Conservatives will have no desire to go into a new election behind his leadership.
Well, Jacob, thank you. I feel like I actually know what's going on now. That was amazing. So the next step, the last step is the government, whatever the proroguing means, that just means that the government doesn't meet again until January. Right?
In a parliamentary system, government means the ministers and the cabinet. The executive, in effect.
Yeah.
The executive is always there. The prime minister is always prime minister. So the government is still there.
Yeah.
What doesn't meet is parliament.
Right,
it doesn't meet until January 26th.
So the parliament doesn't meet, but as soon as parliament meets, they'll be voting on a new budget.
There will be a confidence vote.
And the new budget constitutes a confidence vote.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so then
a budget is due, a budget has to be presented, and a budget is always a confidence vote.
All right. Well, so I think that brings us up to speed. That is crazy. That it's really
it's really crazy.
It's really, really weird. And it really I was on the radio in some show out of Calgary or something like that. I'd written a piece for the Ottawa Citizen congratulating Canadians for not voting for.
Yes, I really liked that piece.
For a record low turnout in the last election, and so I was on a couple radio shows, and there was some crazy guy in the call-in who was talking about, he was some crazy right-winger whose point was that the reason he doesn't vote is because it would legitimate the monarchy, and he refuses to be ruled. He refuses to be a subject of the Queen. And there was some political scientist from Manitoba or something who, a very polite Canadian gentleman who sort of like lightly scoffed and just sort of made the point that the participation of the monarchy in the actual governance of Canada is a mere formality, and it's kind of silly to think that
it turns out that when wacky stuff happens, it matters.
Yeah, and it turns out that the future that this whole episode was determined by the decision of the representative of the Queen.
Yes,
and that's kind of crazy.
She could have made Stéphane Dion prime minister. She could have forced a confidence vote. She could have refused to send Parliament home for a proroguing. She made a set of decisions that seem to have been workable as far as the Canadian public is concerned right now. But in a parliamentary system, when the Prime Minister has discretion over when elections happen and all the rest, there does have to be someone who stands outside of it, who can say yes or no, who can decide in the event of a closed case who gets to be Prime Minister, who gets to form a government, and all that. Usually cases aren't that close. Usually things don't go as strangely as they've gone, but it does sometimes matter. It's happened once in the last generation in Australia. The Governor-General really mattered. And now we've had our moment in recent history in Canada where the Governor-General really mattered.
Now, is there a sense of, embarrassment? Because it brings out the minimal extent to which Canada isn't completely independent from the monarchy. So is there? Because I always had the sense that there was a pride in it being a mere formality, that being a self-contained, self-governing, sovereign, democratic nation, and just having this tradition. So is there any sense of embarrassment that this that something related to the monarchy ended up being decisive in a really fundamental, substantive political issue?
I've lived in Australia as well as living in Canada, and in Australia there's a real sense of embarrassment. There's a live, large Republican movement. By Republican, I mean anti-monarchical. There's a large movement to abolish the tie to the monarchy of Great Britain and have a separate president or chancellor or something else in Australia that will serve as a head of state function in the Australian system.
Mm-hmm.
In Anglophone Canada, I think that there's not.
Yeah.
And in Quebec, the issue isn't that it's a queen, the issue is that it's the British queen. It's the inheritor of the throne who conquered Quebec 200 years ago. And I don't think there's anti-monarchical sentiment that is separate from just secessionist sentiment all around in Quebec. Why? Well, mainly because it's not American. And to have a governor-general and a tie to the Queen of England is one of the things that Canadians can point to as showing that they are importantly different from the U.S. That's just not a central preoccupation in Australian political or cultural identity.
Right.
But it's a huge preoccupation in Canadian political identity.
Yeah.
The tie to the monarchy is actively valued here because it keeps Canada having one foot in Britain rather than being just something that is in the orbit of the United States.
Yeah. New Zealand is interested in not being Australia, like in the way that Canada is interested in not being America. But yeah, but Australia is not so interested in not being. Well, that's amazing. I wanted to talk a little bit about some more of your work about some of the identity politics and multicultural politics that have specifically to do with issues in Quebec. But we're actually running a little short on time. We've only got a few minutes left. Is there anything that you want to just like bring in that you think is especially interesting with the way? Because I'm fascinated by the issue of the kind of strange rump role the Bloc Québécois plays in the national government, and I'm sort of I'm interested in how Quebec works as well. But maybe you have something else you'd like to bring up.
Let me throw in thoughts in two directions. One is the rump role that the Bloc plays in Parliament. I think that there's interesting potential comparative work for political scientists to do about parties in parliaments that are seen to be not legitimate participants in governments. Mm-hmm. The business of putting a majority government together in a parliament when you have to ignore a chunk of the seats is tricky. It's complicated. It can force governments into minority positions. It can force them into uncomfortable coalitions. And the easy assumption among political scientists is, it won't happen. You put together a coalition. But in fact, the post-fascist party in Italy was considered to be out of bounds for any coalition for decades, until Berlusconi finally reached a point where he was able to put a government together only by depending in part on, I think it's called the Forza Italia. Or no, that's Berlusconi's party. I forget what the neo-fascist party is called. The post-communist party in reunified Germany, the post-East German Communist Party, continues to be out of bounds for coalition assembly at the federal level. Mm-hmm. In Israel, a government to be understood to be legitimate always has to have a majority in parliament that is exclusive of the Arab parties, because the Arab parties are not thought to be committed to the constitution of Israel as a Jewish democratic state. Mm-hmm. And in Britain, the parties that are associated with either the IRA or with the Protestant Unionist militant factions in Northern Ireland have been considered out of bounds for assembly government. Now, there are cases to be made for some of these and not others. Mm-hmm. I mean, some are totalitarian or borderline totalitarian. Some are allied to terrorist or guerrilla factions. Mm-hmm. But the Bloc, or the Arab Democratic parties in Israel, or the nationalist parties for the Basques and the Catalans in Spain, these aren't terrorist or anti-liberal or totalitarian or anything like that parties. Yeah. They are just parties that rest on an ethno-cultural base of support that is not necessarily compatible with the ethno-cultural identity of the state as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a real pressure, there's a real tension between the two. I think that it's interesting not only how Anglophones felt about, depending on the bloc, but also how the bloc felt about taking part in government. In the end, it didn't join the coalition. But finally, when faced with a mortal threat to its funding, it did, for the first time, take part in serious discussions about what the government of Canada would be. And it accepted that it might be in a kingmaker role. Mm-hmm. That's a position of responsibility.
Yeah.
It's hard for parties, I think, that have power at their disposal to forever not take part in responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
The bloc has not had any responsibility in either sense. I mean, either having authority or having duties of responsibility for the generation that it's existed. That's now changed. And I'm interested whether it changes the bloc's political culture, whether in some sense, now the bloc has learned that it can decide who the government of Canada is, that it can't forget that, and that in the future it will be a participant with all the pressures that being a real participant brings to bear on it. Mm-hmm. That might domesticate it. That might make it less secessionist and more just an advocate for Quebec interests. I'm not sure, but I think there's a possibility, and I think it's worth keeping an eye on. I talked about that for long enough that maybe I won't go into the other thing about internal Quebec politics.
No, go ahead. I was just, one thing that I was wondering about was, I was just trying to imagine if suppose the U.S. had a constitutional convention and we switched to, this kind of style of parliamentary government. I was just wondering whether there would be a minority party that would form that would have the same status as out of bounds for coalitional participation. And I don't know, maybe I can't think of something off the top of my head, but that might be because the political system we've had prevents these sort of smaller party identities from developing. And so,
but stuff happens in the primaries in the U.S. that is kind of analogous.
Yeah.
The question of how a Democrat is going to view a relationship with Al Sharpton.
Yeah.
Or the question of how a Republican is going to view ties to all kinds of unsavory post-Confederate Southern institutions. Does the Republican give a speech at Bob Jones University? Does the Republican accept an endorsement from Jerry Falwell? Depending on how you structure the electoral rules, there are all kinds of ways that a determined minority, can get a few seats, and a Louis Farrakhan minority, or an Al Sharpton minority, or a Jerry Falwell minority, any of these groups could gain a few seats and be a balance of power.
Mm-hmm.
The presidential system forces them inside the tent of one of the two big parties.
Yeah.
But those to me are the obvious candidates. Either some kind of black nationalist, including Nation of Islam, but not limited to Nation of Islam,
mm-hmm.
Or something that is Southern and fundamentalist Protestant and borderline racist, or all but overtly racist.
Yeah, you can imagine a strongly sort of nationalist, anti-immigration, sort of evangelical party that's very, very extreme, right? Like you could imagine in American politics, if we had the same kind of system, you'd end up with a big kind of Christian conservative party, but you might end up with a few sort of break-off, not conservative enough parties. Doesn't think that the bigger party's conservative enough, and their politics might be so objectionable. And the question is, does the Conservative Party
put together a coalition with the parties to its right,
mm-hmm.
or does it say that they are unacceptable? They're inappropriate for polite company, as it were. If you decide they're unacceptable, then your need to put a government together can force you into strange kinds of decisions.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I think that outside the confines of a presidential system, the U.S. would face moments like this. And over the last 10 years, until this most recent election, the U.S. electorate has been so closely divided, things have fluctuated so nearly around 50%, that it wouldn't take much for some little minority party to hold a balance of power.
Yeah. Well, I think we've run out of time, Jacob. Thanks so much for coming on and doing like utility explaining duty. That's really underutilizing your skills. So I hope you'll come back and we can talk about some of your work in political theory, especially some of your work on multiculturalism and federalism and cosmopolitanism, all stuff that I find fascinating. And so I'd love to have you back. But thanks so much.
I'd be delighted to. I really enjoy talking about those things with you, and let's make sure to do that sometime.
Yeah. Well, may Canada, sort itself out and learn how to behave itself, and just calm down a little bit. Maybe so they should look to their neighbors to the south for a model of how to sort of calmly conduct government.
For lessons on political calmness and comity, absolutely.
Because look at our peaceful, seamless transition that's now occurring. It's so the transition that's occurring now is so seamless that the media basically acts like George Bush is no longer president already. I don't think we'll even notice when the actual formal change occurs because
he has disappeared to a remarkable extent.
President.
I've never seen a presidential transition like it.
No, like President-elect Barack Obama is just sort of like the way it's used is just sort of like he's the president already, you guys. It's just it's a mere formality, and I love the way they have these placards on the podium, the office of presidential transition or whatever, and it makes a lot of sense when you're in the middle of a crisis that you're going to need a really tightly knit coordination between the incoming and outgoing administrations. But more than any other election that I can remember, this is one in which the incoming administration looks like it's kind of already taken charge before it has any official powers, and that's just kind of interesting. But it's completely uncontested, and there's no fireworks about there's no indeterminacy about who's going to be the head of state here in the United States. So
now the Supreme Court has refused to hear the case about Obama's citizenship.
And that's right. And I think details about this cover-up will emerge. So stay tuned. But anyway, thanks so much, Jacob. And
good to talk with you, Will.
Come on again, and we'll talk about more heavy-hitting and less practical stuff.
Looking forward to it.
All right, take care,
Bye.
Jacob.